Ada Cole lived like a shadow stitched to the edges of Silver Mesa, drifting through the dusty streets with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to survive without expecting softness from anyone. People stepped aside when she approached, some with fear, some with fascination, all with the unspoken thrill that came from watching a woman wrapped in a legend she never chose. They called her the Black Widow, a name whispered at poker tables and behind half-closed shutters, a title that clung to her like smoke and refused to loosen its hold. Men joked that any husband of hers would end up 6 feet under, and women muttered prayers when she passed, convinced loss followed her like a faithful dog. Yet none of them knew the truth of the nights she had spent alone, trembling from memories too sharp to forget, aching for gentleness she no longer believed existed. By day she scrubbed the floors of the boarding house kitchen, her hands raw from lie and heat, her shoulders curled in tired strength. At night she moved through the quiet halls, her steps soft, her breath steady, her mind haunted by the faces of men who had loved her fiercely and fallen violently. She never explained, never defended herself, never bothered to correct the stories. The town preferred its monsters, and she refused to waste breath convincing anyone she was human. Loneliness had become her armor, and silence her only companion. Still, beneath the steel she had welded around her heart, a small ember of longing survived. Sometimes she caught herself touching her own wrist in the dark, imagining a hand closing gently around it, guiding her toward warmth rather than pulling her toward danger. She always stopped herself, whispering that such comforts were not meant for a woman like her. One evening her employer asked her to carry a sealed letter to the saloon, a task she accepted without hesitation because refusing would only earn suspicion. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked into the rising night, the wind brushing her skin with a chill that reminded her of every winter she had endured alone. The saloon glowed like a fire pit at the edge of the road, its windows alive with lantern light and the silhouettes of men already deep in their drink. Ada pushed the doors open with the same quiet resolve she carried everywhere, yet when the wood creaked the entire room froze as if God himself had stepped through. Dice stopped mid-roll, whispers died halfway, and every man turned his head to stare at the figure who had crossed the threshold. The lanterns traced the outline of her face, highlighting the tired grace of her cheekbones, the determination in her jaw, and the glimmer of exhaustion that lived behind her eyes. Her dress clung to her slender frame after a full day in the hot kitchen, and the sway of her hips as she stepped forward carried a weary sensuality she did not intend to show. Still, the room drank her in, not with desire but with something darker, as if watching a storm cloud glide across a summer sky. Ada felt their attention settle on her skin like dust, heavy and unwelcomed. She lifted her chin instinctively, steady but tense, refusing to let these men see the small tremor that ran through her whenever she walked into spaces where her name traveled faster than her footsteps. She placed the letter on the counter, murmured the message her employer had sent her with, and turned to leave with the controlled, quiet grace of a woman accustomed to escaping rooms rather than entering them. Just as she reached for the door, something shifted behind her. A breath paused, a voice softened, a gaze anchored. She felt it before she saw it, a slow pull against her spine that urged her to turn. She did, reluctantly, prepared to meet another pair of judging eyes. What she found instead made her heartbeat stumble. A cowboy sat at the far end of the bar, half hidden in the haze of lantern smoke. He was not from Silver Mesa, she would have recognized him. Dust clung to his coat as if he had ridden for miles without pause, and the slight slump of his shoulders suggested a man carrying burdens that bent him toward the ground. His hat rested beside him on the counter, revealing dark hair curled slightly from sweat and travel. But it was his eyes that caught her completely. They were deep and tired, shadowed by stories he had not yet spoken, yet burning with a strange recognition she could not name. There was woundedness in them, yes, but also a softness so unexpected she felt heat rise along her throat. He did not look away when their gazes met. He did not whisper the cruel nickname the others used. He did not flinch from her presence as if she carried death in her palms. His attention lingered with an intimacy that startled her, a slow, deliberate study that traced the outline of her face, followed the curve of her neck, and rested respectfully on the trembling rise and fall of her breath. She felt seen in a way that made her skin warm, a subtle awakening that stirred under her ribs with a sensation dangerously close to desire. For years she had moved through Silver Mesa as if invisible, yet under this stranger's gaze she felt as if a forbidden light had settled on her, coaxing her forward rather than pushing her away. Ada told herself to step out into the cool night, to retreat before anything inside her cracked open, but her feet refused to move. The stranger's eyes held her in place, inviting but not demanding, gentle but undeniably hungry for something she did not yet understand. A slow breath escaped his lips, and she watched the way his chest lifted, strong beneath the fabric of his shirt, steady in a way that felt strangely protective. He tilted his head slightly, acknowledging her without speaking, and something about the gesture brushed against a part of her heart she had sealed long ago. Ada Cole had been unseen for years. In one fragile moment inside a noisy saloon, she realized someone was watching her, not with fear or suspicion but with a quiet longing that shimmered beneath the surface like heat rising from the desert floor. It unsettled her. It thrilled her. And it awakened a part of her she thought had died with the last man who had ever touched her with tenderness. Elias Ward had learned long ago that the road was a better companion than people. Towns blurred into one another, faces faded like dust in the wind, and memories followed him like shadows he could not outrun. He rode because stopping meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling, something he had sworn he would never do again. His silence was not a habit but armor. Each mile he crossed thickened the shell around him, until he lived more like a ghost than a man. Still, on the night he arrived in Silver Mesa, something felt different. He entered the saloon only to warm himself from the long ride, expecting nothing more than a drink and a quiet corner. The moment Ada stepped through the doors, however, the quiet corner vanished from his thoughts as if someone had struck a match inside his chest. Lantern light poured over her like warm honey, painting her skin in soft gold and revealing shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of nights she never slept fully. The room froze, but Elias did not. He watched her walk with a grace that seemed carved from exhaustion and stubborn strength. Every man in the saloon stared at her as if she were a bad omen, but Elias saw something different. He saw a woman holding herself together with sheer will, a woman who moved like someone carrying too much pain and too little comfort. There was a tightness in her shoulders that made him want to step closer and loosen it with his hands, a hesitance in her breath that stirred something deep inside him. He had seen beautiful women before, but Ada Cole struck him with a different kind of force, a quiet gravity that pulled at him without permission. When she dropped the envelope on the counter and murmured her message, he recognized the tone instantly. It was the voice of someone who didn't expect to be spoken to with softness. She finished her task and turned with a poise that made his breath pause. He could feel her trying to glide out of the room untouched, but beneath that grace he sensed the ache of someone who wanted to be unseen and yet longed to be held, if only for one night, by arms that meant no harm. Something in him shifted sharply, and for the first time in months, he felt an urge to stand. His chair scraped softly against the floor. She stopped just enough to acknowledge the sound, not enough to invite it. Elias removed his hat, a gesture that surprised even himself, and stepped toward her with slow, deliberate movements. He did not want to frighten her or confirm the town's cruelty, but he could not let her walk away without offering a moment of truth in a world full of lies about her. When he spoke, his voice dropped into a tone he rarely used, one that carried warmth rather than warning. He told her she looked like she had carried too much alone, and the moment the words left his mouth he felt something ripple inside him, as if he had spoken a confession rather than an observation. Her spine straightened in immediate defense, and he understood. She was a woman used to knives disguised as compliments, hands disguised as kindness, and promises disguised as traps. Her eyes met his with a startling intensity, not angry but wary, as if assessing whether he was another man who wanted to claim something from her. In that brief exchange their breaths mingled in the warm saloon air, and Elias felt heat travel through him in a way he had not felt in years. The closeness was accidental, yet every inch between them hummed with a tension that made him want to reach out and tuck the loose strand of hair behind her ear just to feel her skin brush his fingers. She told him she did not need saving, and he believed her. Her voice held the firmness of someone who had faced monsters far worse than loneliness. Still, he told her softly that he never said she did, only that he was not afraid of her shadow. As he spoke, his gaze traced the delicate line of her jaw, the steady rise of her chest, the faint tremble in her fingers that betrayed more vulnerability than she intended to show. He did not think of touching her, yet the thought slipped through him with slow, sinful warmth. He wondered how her skin would feel beneath his hands, whether her breath would quicken if he leaned closer, whether she would push him away or melt against him after years of being untouched by tenderness. A flicker of longing moved through him, uninvited and undeniable. Her breath caught, and he felt the shift immediately. It was not fear but the shock of being spoken to gently, the shock of a man stepping closer rather than retreating in disgust or superstition. She did not respond. She simply turned and walked out, her hips swaying in a rhythm so natural and weary that Elias felt a slow ache unfurl in his chest. He watched her push through the saloon doors and vanish into the night, her silhouette framed by moonlight before disappearing entirely. He stood there longer than he meant to, hat still in hand, breathing in the faint trace of her scent that lingered in the air, a mixture of wood smoke and worn cotton and something softer he could not name. Elias sat back down, but he did not touch his drink. His eyes remained fixed on the doors she had walked through, as if expecting her to return. Something about her burrowed under his skin, warm and unsettling. He thought of the grief she carried like armor, the loneliness written in her posture, and the fragile spark he had glimpsed in her eyes when he spoke to her. He imagined her walking alone through Silver Mesa, shoulders tight against the cold, breath trembling as she returned to a room no one waited in. He had known women who hid behind beauty and men who hid behind arrogance, but Ada hid behind strength, and that strength made him want to peel back the layers slowly, with patience, with hands that would learn her carefully. He knew then that she would not leave his thoughts tonight, nor any night soon. When the bartender asked if he wanted another drink, Elias declined. He stepped outside into the cool darkness, the taste of her nearness still lingering on his breath. As he looked at the empty street where she had disappeared, he felt a quiet certainty rise within him. He had followed many roads, but this time it felt like the road was following him, drawing him toward the one woman he should have avoided but could not forget. The night was still. The air was sharp. And Elias Ward found himself staring into the dark, knowing he would be watching for her again. Silver Mesa always woke with a thirst for scandal, and when it came to Ada Cole the town drank deeply. The night she crossed paths with the newcomer had been enough to set every tongue wagging, and by sunrise the gossip swirled through the dusty streets like smoke from a burning barn. Men at the livery muttered that she was hunting for her next husband, while women braiding laundry lines confessed low and eager that she had trapped the stranger with a single look. Children repeated what they overheard at home, whispering that she carried death in her skirts and that anyone who came near her would meet the same fate as her husband's. The stories grew with each telling, some cruel, some absurd, none of them softened by truth. Silver Mesa needed Ada to remain a myth, and myths were easier to maintain when no one bothered to ask the woman herself what pain she carried under her quiet steps. That morning Ada swept the boarding house porch with steady, practiced movements, yet every stroke of the broom felt sharper than usual. She could feel the stairs prickling her skin like heated needles, each glance heavy with suspicion and morbid delight. Her jaw tightened as two women across the street paused their conversation the moment they spotted her. They lowered their voices, but she could still sense the rhythm of their judgment, the tilt of their heads signaling that she was once again the center of a tale that was not hers to tell. Her cheeks warmed despite the coolness of the morning air, not with shame but with the exhaustion of having to live beneath a weight she never chose. She told herself not to care, yet she could not stop the slow coil of humiliation tightening inside her. What stung most was not the lies but the ease with which people embraced them, as if believing the worst about her brought them a sense of comfort or control. Still, gossip alone never frightened Ada. She had endured far harsher cruelties and survived losses that would have crushed a softer woman. What unsettled her was something else entirely, a shift in the town's atmosphere that felt like the drop in air before a storm. She sensed danger not in whispers but in the quiet spread of a rumor that men she once feared had returned. By mid-morning, she learned it was true. The Copper Knives, a gang known for carving their mark into anything that crossed their path, had come back to Silver Mesa after nearly 2 years of hiding from the law. Their presence was like a shadow falling across the valley. Even the bravest townsmen muttered prayers, and shop doors closed earlier than usual. The leader, Vance Corbett, was the kind of man whose smile was sharper than any blade he carried. Ada knew him well enough to feel her heartbeat shift in her chest the moment someone whispered his name. Years earlier, after the death of her second husband, Vance had cornered her outside the churchyard, breath heavy with whiskey and arrogance, trying to force her into a marriage she never asked for. When she refused him, he had gripped her wrist hard enough to leave bruises and told her that one day she would regret pushing him away. She remembered the bitterness of that grip, the heat of his breath, and the cold certainty in his eyes. She had reported nothing, knowing the town would believe him before they believed her. Her refusal became another chapter in the twisted myth of the Black Widow, one she had no power to erase. That morning Ada stepped into the yard to gather firewood stacked near the well. The sun hung low and pale behind drifting clouds, casting long shadows across the ground. As she bent to lift a bundle, the wooden handle scraped against the earth, sending a shiver through her as the sound echoed too loudly. She felt someone watching her, a sensation so sudden and sharp that she straightened without thinking. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw him. Vance Corbett leaned casually against a hitching post, his arms crossed, his mouth curled into a smirk that made her stomach twist. His clothes were dusty from travel, but his posture carried the same sickening confidence she remembered. His gaze swept over her body in a slow, deliberate line, tracing her curves with a hunger that made her skin crawl. She tightened her grip on the firewood, resisting the urge to retreat toward the boarding house. "Well now," he drawled, pushing off the post with a leisurely stride, "the Black Widow's still free." His voice was smooth, mocking, threaded with the kind of familiarity that made Ada's pulse quicken for all the wrong reasons. She tried to step aside, but he moved into her path with ease, the space between them tightening in a way that felt almost suffocating. He leaned close enough that she caught the scent of whiskey on his breath, mixed with the earthy musk of sweat and horsehide. Her body instinctively tensed, though she kept her expression cold and unreadable. Vance tilted his head, letting his eyes drift lower than they should, lingering a moment too long before meeting her gaze. "You owe me a yes," he murmured, voice dropping to a low rumble that brushed along her skin like a blade. "And one day, I'll collect." Ada felt the chill run down her spine, a sensation that blended fear with a strange spark of anger. She had spent years building the walls around herself, walls no man had the right to break. She opened her mouth to speak, though she was not sure what words would come, when something shifted in the corner of her vision. Across the street, leaning against the trunk of an old cottonwood tree, stood Elias Ward. His posture was relaxed, almost lazy, but the hardness in his eyes betrayed the truth. His jaw was clenched, and his hands curled slowly at his sides. He looked at Vance with a quiet intensity that radiated danger, yet he kept his gaze calm, controlled, powerful. The sight of him watching so fiercely sparked something warm and trembling inside Ada's chest. She had not expected anyone to stand for her, least of all the stranger whose eyes had held hers so gently the night before. Elias did not move from the tree, yet his presence alone was enough to shift the air. It was the silent promise in his gaze, the protective tension in his stance, the unspoken acknowledgement that he would not let her face this man alone. Ada felt a slow heat unfurl beneath her ribs, a mixture of gratitude and something darker, something that pulsed with quiet longing. And in that moment Elias Ward made a decision, one she could feel even before he acted. He would not let wolves circle her again, not while he was still breathing. The storm rolled into Silver Mesa like an uninvited guest, heavy and furious, swallowing the sky in dark thunderheads that cracked open with streaks of white fire. By late afternoon the wind howled through the streets, lifting dust and grit in violent spirals that stung the skin. Rain slammed against rooftops hard enough to shake loose splinters, and the old boarding house groaned under the force of it, trembling with each gust as if it might buckle at the corners. Ada stood near her small window, watching sheets of water blur the world outside until it looked like a landscape disappearing behind glass. She hugged her arms around herself, trying to steady the unease curling in her stomach. She had endured storms before. She had endured far worse than storms. Yet something about this one felt different, heavier, charged with a tension that fizzed through the air like electricity searching for a place to land. A sudden knock thundered through the hallway, sharp and urgent. Ada froze. She reached for the chair near her bed, fingers brushing it as if it could become a shield, but the second knock followed immediately, soaked through with urgency rather than anger. She took a breath, stepped to the door, and opened it just wide enough to see who stood on the other side. Elias Ward filled the doorway like a silhouette carved from dark wood and rainwater, hair dripping, coat plastered to his broad shoulders. The storm had drenched him completely, but his eyes held a clear focus that cut through the dim hallway and landed on her with an intensity that made her pulse jump. He spoke quietly, yet the depth in his voice carried like a steady drumbeat. He told her that Vance and his boys were drinking themselves brave tonight and that she could not stay in the boarding house with danger brewing so close. Ada's instinct was to straighten and claim she could survive anything. Her lips shaped the familiar answer, insisting she had survived worse, yet her hands betrayed her, trembling against the doorframe. Elias noticed. He always noticed. Something flickered across his face, something tender and unguarded, as if seeing her fear pulled loose a thread of emotion he had tried to keep hidden. He stepped closer, not enough to intimidate, only enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cold rain soaking his clothes. He told her he knew she could endure, but that did not mean she had to do it alone. The words washed over her like heat slipping beneath her skin, unsettling and strangely comforting. Lightning cracked outside, bathing him in a flash of white light that softened the ruggedness of his face and revealed the unmistakable truth in his eyes. He wanted to protect her, not claim her, not dominate her, not trap her. Protect her. Against every instinct she had honed for survival, Ada made a choice. She opened the door wider and stepped out into the hallway, letting Elias guide her toward the rear exit where the wind screamed through the eaves. He placed his coat over her shoulders, the fabric still soaked but carrying the scent of leather and something darker, something that belonged only to him. They pushed into the storm, bodies close as they moved through the swirling rain, their breaths labored against the cold. The path to the abandoned barn felt endless, each step a battle against mud and whipping wind, yet Elias stayed beside her, his arm brushing hers, steady and grounding. She could feel his presence through the chaos, a warmth that wrapped around her even when the storm tried to rip it away. By the time they reached the barn, Ada's dress clung to her body like a second skin, wet fabric tracing the curves she had spent years hiding. Elias pushed open the heavy door and guided her inside, the air thick with the scent of hay and damp wood. He moved with purpose, striking a match and lighting the lantern that hung from a crooked beam. The warm glow spread slowly across the space, flickering against the wooden walls and revealing floating dust that shimmered like sparks in the air. Ada stood near the center of the room, catching her breath, her chest rising and falling in uneven waves. Her damp dress outlined the shape of her hips, her waist, the gentle swell of her breasts, and she felt the heat of Elias's gaze tracing the silhouette of her figure before he forced himself to look away. Yet he stepped closer. The lantern light curved along the lines of his jaw, highlighting the faint bruise forming near his temple and the tautness in his movements, as if he were fighting the pull toward her with only the last threads of his discipline. Ada felt her own resistance waver. The storm outside roared so loudly that the barn seemed to sway with each gust, and for a brief moment she imagined the world falling away until only this space remained, warm and quiet and lit by the fire of a single lantern. The closeness between them shimmered with something fragile and forbidden, a tension that settled heavy in the air, thick with longing neither of them dared to acknowledge aloud. Elias took one step forward, then another, slow and deliberate, as if approaching a wild creature he did not want to startle. When he finally stood near enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek, he lowered his voice to a whisper that brushed along her skin like a feather. He told her to let him hold her tonight. Not for lust, not for possession, but because he could see the way loneliness had carved itself into her bones. His words trembled with a quiet longing that made her knees weaken. She met his eyes, and for a moment neither of them breathed. She saw the vulnerability he kept buried beneath his silence, the desire he struggled to contain, and the sincerity that made the offer feel like a lifeline rather than a temptation. For the first time in years, Ada nodded. She stepped toward him, closing the last inch of space between their bodies. His arms circled her slowly, reverently, as if unsure he had permission to touch her fully. When she leaned into him, the warmth of his body melted through the wet fabric of her dress, and she felt his breath tremble against her temple. His hands rested carefully at the small of her back, strong but gentle, anchoring her with a touch that was both protective and intoxicating. Her palms slid against the soaked cotton of his shirt, feeling the rough strength of the muscles beneath, and a wave of heat rippled through her, slow and sweet, awakening parts of her she thought had withered long ago. They stood like that, bodies pressed together while the storm raged around them, sharing the kind of intimacy that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with need. The barn glowed softly with lantern light, wrapping them in warmth as the world outside shook with thunder. In his arms, Ada felt something she had not felt in years, something deep and tender and terrifying. She felt safe. She felt wanted. And she felt the steady exhale of a man who needed her presence just as much as she needed his. The storm had not fully passed when the night surrendered to the earliest hint of dawn, that fragile hour when the world lay suspended between darkness and light. The barn still held the warmth of the small fire Elias had built, and Ada woke in the circle of his arms, her cheek resting against the steady rise and fall of his chest. For a moment she allowed herself the softness of that closeness, inhaling the faint scent of leather and rain clinging to him, letting her body relax into the comfort she had denied herself for so many years. His hands remained at her waist as if his sleeping mind refused to release her, and the memory of how those hands had pulled her against him during the storm stirred a gentle heat beneath her skin. She had not meant to fall asleep beside him, nor to allow her body to melt so easily into his. Yet here she was, wrapped in the warmth of a man who held her as if she was something precious. But dawn rarely brought peace to Silver Mesa, and it certainly did not bring peace to the ruined barn. The first warning came as a sudden crash that rattled the wooden walls, followed by a sharp shout that tore Ada fully awake. Boots pounded through the mud outside, heavy and hurried, and she felt Elias tense beneath her even before his eyes opened. He rose in one fluid motion, pulling her behind him without hesitation. She barely had time to breathe before the barn door burst open and the copper knives poured inside, their coats dripping with rain, their eyes glinting with the kind of malice that had haunted her nightmares for years. Vance Corbett led them, his smile curved with venom and victory, his gun already raised as he stepped into the lantern glow. Elias did not move from his place in front of her. His body formed a solid barrier, broad and warm, and Ada could feel the tension coiling through his muscles like a barely restrained storm of his own. Vance took another step, savoring the fear he expected to see in her eyes, and snarled that Elias had picked the wrong woman. His voice dripped with cruelty as he claimed she was cursed and warned that Elias would die like the others. The words sliced through Ada, reopening wounds she had spent years trying to close. Elias, however, did not flinch. His voice was steady, quiet, dangerously calm as he told Vance that those men had not died from curses but at the hands of monsters like him. The truth in his tone cut sharper than any blade, and for an instant Ada felt a rush of fierce gratitude toward him that warmed her even through her fear. The barn exploded into motion before she could find her voice. Vance lunged forward and Elias met him head-on, their bodies colliding with brutal force. The other men surged in, fists swinging, boots sliding through the mud that had seeped across the barn floor. Elias moved with a ferocity she had never seen, every punch fueled by something deeper than anger, something rooted in instinct and protection. He fought like a man who had already decided he would not fall, not here, not now, not while she stood behind him shaking with fear. Ada watched in breathless horror as a blade flashed in the lantern light and sank into Elias's shoulder. Blood spread quickly through the wet fabric of his shirt, yet he did not stagger. He gritted his teeth and knocked the attacker back with a force that sent the man crashing into a pile of broken crates. The chaos grew louder. Gunshots cracked through the morning air, echoing against the barn walls. Horses outside whinnied and scattered, hooves thundering through the mud as the storm's remnants hissed against the falling rain. Ada tried to stay behind Elias, but the fight shifted too quickly. A pair of arms grabbed her from behind, rough and unyielding, dragging her toward the door. She felt the cold sting of fear slice through her chest as she twisted and struggled, her fingers clawing at the hand clamped around her waist. It was Vance. His breath brushed against her neck, hot and bitter, as he pulled her back with a dark promise she had prayed never to hear again. A roar split through the barn, raw and primal. Elias tore himself free from his attackers, blood dripping from his shoulder, eyes blazing with a fury she had never seen in him. When he shouted her name, Ada felt the sound vibrate through her bones. It carried a desperation that broke something open inside her. He launched himself at Vance with a force so fierce that all three of them fell into the mud outside the barn. The men tumbled through the muck, fists flying, bodies slamming against the soaked ground. Ada scrambled away, her breath ragged, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Elias pinned Vance with a strength that came not from his muscles but from something burning inside him, something that refused to lose her. The fight raged until the remaining copper knives realized the tide had turned. Their resolve faltered and they fled into the darkened brush beyond the barn, wounded and shaken, leaving Vance broken in the mud and Elias dripping with rain and blood. Ada stumbled toward him, her hands trembling as she dropped to her knees beside him. The lantern light spilled through the barn door, catching on the sheen of sweat and the streaks of rain across his face. His breaths came unevenly, and when he spat blood into the mud she felt panic seize her chest. She touched his cheek with shaking fingers, her voice barely more than a whisper as she told him he was hurt. Elias looked at her with eyes softened by pain but still full of the same quiet devotion he had shown the night before. He rasped that he would do it again, 10 times over, for her. The words struck her in a place deeper than fear, deeper than gratitude, deeper than anything she had allowed herself to feel since the first man she ever loved was lowered into the earth. Her throat tightened, and before she could stop herself, tears spilled from her eyes, warm and uncontrollable. She had not cried like this since her husband's grave, and the emotion poured through her with a force she could not contain. When Elias reached up with his good hand and brushed her tears with the gentlest touch she had felt in years, her chest tightened with a longing she could no longer deny. Elias lost consciousness before Ada could pull him fully into the shelter of the barn, his body sinking into the straw with a heaviness that terrified her. Blood soaked through the torn fabric of his shirt, spreading warm and dark across her hands as she pressed against the wound, whispering his name with a desperation she had not felt in years. The storm outside eased into a wet hush, but inside her chest the storm only grew stronger, tightening around her ribs with each ragged breath Elias took. She dragged blankets toward him, lifting his head carefully and easing him into the makeshift bed she created from hay and cloth. Her fingers trembled as she tore strips of fabric and pressed them against his shoulder, trying to slow the bleeding. When his eyes fluttered open just long enough to murmur her name, a mix of fear and longing surged through her. She told him to stay awake, to hold on, but he slipped again into darkness, leaving her with nothing but the sound of his uneven breathing and the chilling memory of how fiercely he had fought for her. For 2 days she tended him without rest, her body running on nothing but adrenaline and dread. She refused to leave his side, not even to fetch water unless she could still hear the rasp of his breath from where he lay. She washed the blood from his skin with careful movements, her fingertips brushing along the heat of his fevered body as she wiped away mud and sweat. The closeness stirred something deep within her, something that rose unbidden each time she touched his bare skin or felt the faint quiver of his muscles under her hands. She had tended men before, but not like this, not with a heart that ached and a pulse that quickened each time he whispered her name in delirious confusion. When he tossed and turned in fever, he called out for her with the same intensity he had shown in the fight, as if her name alone was the rope keeping him tethered to life. At night she lay curled beside him, not sleeping, simply listening to his breathing and resting her palm lightly against his chest. The warmth of his skin seeped into her, softening the cold core she had built within herself for years. Each time his fever surged, she held his face between her hands and whispered for him to stay. There were moments when his breath hitched and his fingers clutched weakly at her wrist, and she felt the tremble of something like desire ripple through her, unexpected yet impossible to ignore. She had kept walls around her heart since the day she buried her first husband, walls built of grief and guilt and the cruel whispers of the town. Yet here she was, tearing those walls down piece by piece as she cared for the man who had nearly died trying to protect her. When Elias finally awoke for real, it was with a slow inhale that seemed to pull the entire barn into stillness. Ada had been dozing lightly with her head resting near his shoulder, and she lifted her gaze the moment she felt his fingers move. His hand found hers instinctively, warm and firm despite his weakness, and the simple touch sent a shiver through her body. He looked at her with a softness that tightened her throat, his voice rasping her name in a way that made her chest ache. He told her he was not afraid of what she had been through, and she felt the words settle into the deepest cracks of her heart, filling places she had long believed were too broken to mend. She pulled her hand away slowly, unable to face the tenderness in his eyes. Her voice trembled as she confessed the truth she had kept buried from everyone, even herself. She told him her husbands had not died from curses or accidents, but from protecting her against a man who refused to accept that she belonged to herself. She spoke haltingly, each word scraping against old wounds. She told him how the town twisted the story because believing she brought death was easier than admitting men could be cruel enough to take lives simply to claim a woman who did not want them. As she spoke, shame crawled along her spine, thick and familiar, wrapping itself around her ribs like a vice. Elias reached for her hand again, his fingers gentle and steady. He told her she did not owe shame to scars carved by other men's violence. His voice carried no pity, only truth, and it pierced her defenses with a force stronger than any threat Vance had ever made. She felt her breath falter, her vision blur, her heart clench in a painful rush of emotion. No one had spoken to her like that before. Not her husbands, not the preacher, not the women who avoided her, not even herself. He tried to sit up, grimacing from the pain in his shoulder, but determined to look at her fully. Ada moved forward to support him, her hands slipping around his back, her body pressed close to his as she helped him rise. The warmth between them grew thicker, more intimate, as he leaned into her touch. His breath fanned across her cheek, stirring a quiet heat in her that spread slowly through her body. He whispered that he wanted to walk beside her, with no fear and no judgment, and the sincerity in his words made her feel as though the world had expanded around them, softening the sharp edges of her life. Ada lowered her head, unable to speak. Her body moved on its own, leaning into him until her forehead rested against his shoulder. Her hands tightened around his back for support, and she felt his fingers caress the small of her spine with a touch that was tender enough to unravel her completely. Tears slipped silently onto his shirt, soaking into the fabric as she let herself collapse into vulnerability she had not shown in years. Elias wrapped his good arm around her, holding her with a gentle strength that made her feel safe in a way she had never dared hope for again. The closeness of their bodies, the warmth of their breath, the slow slide of his fingers against her back created an intimacy that was more potent than any kiss, more profound than any whispered promise. In that quiet moment, walls she had spent years fortifying crumbled, replaced by a trust she had not expected to give and a longing she could no longer deny. When Elias recovered enough to stand, he insisted on going to the sheriff, but this time Ada did not retreat into the shadows or slip away down the back streets of Silver Mesa. She stepped beside him in the clear morning light, her shoulders squared, her hand never far from his, drawing strength from the quiet heat that lingered between them since the night she held him through fever. They walked through the center of town while every porch, every window, every doorway seemed to hold eyes that had once judged her and now watched in uneasy silence. It was the first time in years she refused to lower her head. If Elias felt the weight of those stares, he did not show it. His arm brushed against hers with deliberate steadiness, a wordless message that told her she was not alone and would never be pushed into the shadows again. Inside the sheriff's office, Elias spoke first, his voice firm and low as he described the attack in the barn. Ada's throat tightened as the sheriff turned to her and asked if she wished to add anything. For a long moment she could not find her voice. Years of silence, years of swallowing her truth until it tasted like poison, all knotted in her chest. Then Elias stepped just close enough that she felt the warmth of his body at her side, enough to let her draw a breath that carried courage. She told the sheriff everything. She told him about Vance Corbett's obsession, about the threats, about the violence her husbands had fought off before paying the ultimate price. She told him how fear had chained her, how the town's whispers had twisted her into something monstrous rather than acknowledging the brutality she had endured. Her voice shook, but she did not stop, and Elias watched her with a look that mingled pride and protective tenderness. By the time she finished, the sheriff's face held no suspicion, only regret that he had believed the rumors for so long. He wrote the charges himself and promised Vance would not escape justice again. When Ada stepped out into the sunlight, she felt lighter, almost dizzy, as though a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten its shape had finally slipped from her shoulders. Elias touched her arm to steady her, his hand lingering with a gentle heat that made her pulse quicken. For the first time in years, she felt no need to pull away. Silver Mesa was forced to face the truth. Whispers gradually faded, replaced by nods of respect from people who had once crossed the street to avoid her. Martha Lopez, who ran the bakery, handed Ada a warm roll without asking for payment. Old Mr. Green tipped his hat when she passed. Even the children who used to hide behind their mother's skirts now watched her with curious eyes rather than fear. Every gesture was small, but each one chipped away another piece of the legend that had imprisoned her. Elias stayed close throughout those days, not hovering, not claiming her, simply existing in a way that let her feel his presence like a protective wind. He walked beside her during errands, taught her how to tighten the girth on a saddle, and sometimes, when they passed through the far side of town where no one could see them, his hand brushed hers in a way that made warmth unfurl slowly through her chest. Their conversations grew easier, their silences more intimate, and sometimes, in the quiet of evening, she caught him watching her with an expression that softened the hard lines of his face. One evening, beneath a sky streaked in rose and violet, they walked along the ridge above the town, a place where the wind moved gently and the world felt wide enough for new beginnings. The light made Elias's face look almost tender, the rough edges of his features softened by the fading sun. He stopped and reached for her hands, his thumbs brushing slow circles along her skin with a touch that felt both reverent and longing. She felt the heat of him through her fingers, the subtle tremble of his breath, the pull of something deeper rising between them. He told her he was no good with speeches, but he knew loneliness had nearly killed both of them, and he would not let it finish the job. His voice was rough, threaded with sincerity that made her chest tighten. She asked what he was really asking, though part of her already knew, because the way he held her hands and the way he looked at her was no longer the gaze of a man simply offering safety. It was the gaze of someone choosing her with his whole being. He told her he wanted her to stay with him in whatever way she was ready for. No pressure, no possession, just two souls finally stepping out of the dark. His words stirred a warmth low in her belly, a steady, pulsing heat that blended with the tenderness rising inside her. She looked into his weathered face, saw the vulnerability beneath his strength, and felt a tremor run through her. The choice before her felt like reclaiming her own name, her own life, her own desire. She stepped closer, close enough that his breath touched her lips. Her fingertips slid up his arms, feeling the solidity of him, the quiet strength that had sheltered her again and again. When she whispered that she was ready, Elias exhaled with a sound that carried relief and hunger and gratitude all at once. He drew her against him with a care that felt like devotion, his hands settling at her waist, his forehead resting gently against hers. In that quiet embrace, in the faint press of their bodies, in the warmth shared between them, Ada felt the future she had once feared finally opening like dawn across the horizon. Months passed in a slow unfurling of warmth that felt almost impossible after the years Ada had spent hiding from daylight. Elias finished the cabin on the ridge in early spring, its wooden beams carved by his own hands, its porch facing the sunrise so she would never again wake in darkness. Ada planted sunflowers along the path, their bright faces rising toward the sky as though reclaiming light she once believed no longer belonged to her. Each morning she walked barefoot through the soft earth, feeling the ground hold her gently, as if welcoming a woman who had finally earned her place in the world. Her laughter returned gradually, at first a soft exhale, then a warm sound that filled the cabin the way sunlight filled the windows. She cooked while Elias worked the fields, humming under her breath, and sometimes he paused in the doorway just to watch the curve of her smile. When she caught him looking, he pretended to adjust his hat, but the warmth in his eyes betrayed his admiration. She felt it ripple through her like a secret caress. The townsfolk no longer whispered when she walked by. Children waved. Women greeted her with small nods, unsure at first but sincere. Men lifted their hats with respect rather than suspicion. For the first time in her life, Ada Cole was seen not as a rumor or a shadow but as a woman who had survived and rebuilt herself from the dust. She felt the shift with every step she took through the dusty streets, her spine straight, her gaze steady, her heart no longer barricaded behind old wounds. Silver Mesa learned her story, and understanding replaced fear. They spoke her name with a gentleness that used to feel foreign. On the ridge, evenings carried their own quiet intimacies. The light turned golden across the valley, bathing the cabin in soft warmth as Elias came to sit beside her. Sometimes he returned from tending the horses with dust on his shirt, the scent of sun and sweat clinging to him in a way that made her pulse rise. She would stand close enough to untie his bandana, her fingers brushing the strong line of his throat, and she felt the subtle shiver that always followed her touch. He kissed her gently at first, then deeper as the days grew longer, his hands learning the slow curves of her back, her waist, her hips. She allowed herself to be held without flinching, allowed desire to unfold without fear, allowed the warmth of his body to remind her that tenderness could be strong and steady rather than dangerous. One evening, as the sun spilled its last gold across the hills, Elias drew her against him, his breath warm against the curve of her neck. He whispered the same words that had once changed everything, letting them roll slow and tender from his chest. She felt his voice vibrate through her skin, awakening a familiar bloom of heat low in her belly. When he asked her to let him hold her that night, she leaned into him with a confidence born from healing rather than desperation. Her answer came soft yet sure, carrying the weight of all the nights she had once spent alone. She told him she wanted every night after, and the wind lifted her words into the open sky as if marking the beginning of a quiet legacy. Ada Cole, once unseen, now stood firmly within a life shaped by her own courage. In Elias's arms and in the home they built together, she was held, chosen, and truly seen.